Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from... My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we welcome back a little-known, up-and-coming author by the name of Stratton-Kent. Jake has been researching, writing, and somewhat crucially practicing grimoiric magic for decades, and he joins us in this episode to talk about his latest book, Pandemonium, a discordant concordance of diverse spirit catalogues. Mr. Stratton-Kent, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Gordon.
Lovely, lovely. And we are talking to you again today because you have a new book out, and it's a book we've been... Actually, you and I have been talking about off and on for a good number of years now. So
it seems like it anyway.
Yeah. They feel like it at the end of the project. You go, have I ever done anything else with my entire life?
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's pretty much it.
Pandemonium, what even is it?
Well, it's not a dictionary of demons. It's a sort of an A to Z of the spirit catalogues. A to Z as in A to Z of London. How to find your way around. Who are they? Where else have they been? Do we have to take particular notice of one given structure when they're in so many others? Isn't it them that's important? And yeah, that was my kind of raison d'etre, as it were.
Well, you began by describing what it isn't, and I think that's an important point, and it's quite a complicated thing to do, to present a structure of how you think about structure so that you don't think too structurally.
Yes. Allow it to be vague. Enjoy the vagueness.
Well, I mean, okay, let's try and put that into context for people. What is a spirit list? Why did they end up being listed? Like, what is this form that you were exploring in an A to Z of London fashion in this book? What is this form, and where did it come from?
Well, the main reason behind them is practical. They're a register of the spirits that a particular magician might be working with, and theoretically their names and seals all go into a specially consecrated book which they agree on, that they will come when called, and so on. And in the Grimoires you find a reflection of this Liber Spirituum, saying, these are the ones that you could make yours with, sort of thing.
And carry on.
Different ideas about what the structure behind it is, are fairly common. So no one of them is set in stone.
Well, that's kind of the point. If we're looking at so broadly speaking, we can say they emerged. So Trithemius is 1400s. I think LDE is the same. But what's interesting, I think, about the form of a spirit list is there is precedent further back. You can describe something. It doesn't have the seals, and you talk about where and how seals came into the whole grimoire form in this particular book, but you have examples of effectively spirit lists, something like the Testament of Solomon, if you kind of jump back 1,000 years from the 1400s.
Yeah, there's particularly interesting recension. Testament of Solomon has very similar spirit lists, or at least considerable crossover. And one of the guys on the Solomonic forum, is in the acknowledgements, came up with a translation from the Greek. I thought, so this stuff's in Greek first, like not just the Hygromantia is much like the Key of Solomon. There seems to be a proto-spirit list in Greek as well. So that was an intriguing lead that turned up in the course of this digging. And the legions are there given in Greek gematria values as well, the letters equivalent to the number. So that is quite an intriguing lead. But yeah. old.
Yeah, old, but also improving in its geolocality because it is Greek and the sort of my understanding of the broad consensus of the where and when of the Testament of Solomon is in that same Eastern Mediterranean Greek world, despite it being called Solomon. You have it came from a world that when we talk about the Greek world, we're not necessarily talking about the Greeks, but we are.
No, we might be talking about Greek-speaking Jews in Egypt, to make it extra complicated. I think that's where the Spirit Register in the Testament of Solomon started out. It is the Jewish element of the text, but it was written in Greek, shows Hermetic ideas and Egyptian influence. So it's very likely a Jewish community in Egypt. And then that links up somehow with stuff going on in Ephesus and in modern Turkey, Alexandria, again in Egypt. So it's a pretty cosmopolitan world. They just happen to speak and write Greek.
Yes, we magicians were doing multiculturalism before it was cool.
Yeah.
All right, so let's pick up the story then of when the lists emerge back into Europe, because it sort of it happens, as do most of the grimoires, following the fall of Constantinople / Byzantium, and the appearance then of tutors and Greeks and people fleeing with their libraries and their cool stuff back into sort of Western Europe. And then we have this moment of, and this is largely, I suspect, as you say, there's not like a definitive list from the 1400s, because you're now dealing with a collection of you have, as we mentioned in the book, there's clerical underground, there's lawyers, there's all these people playing with these ideas and thinking about them and working out what they might mean for reality, and just really having a go at it, because that kind of mode had been missing from the West for a while. Would you say that's kind of why we end up with lists rather than list?
Yeah, so something like that. I mean, variation seems to be part of it from quite early on. Numbers, and even whether it's elemental or planetary or zodiacal or whatever, there doesn't seem to have settled down. I suspect it's a bit more complicated than coming straight from Byzantium. There's probably some Arab influence going on as well. But I mean, these things are always complicated. One Uber cause doesn't really cut any ice, but Constantinople is a huge part of it because of the Greek element, and meanwhile the Arabs are translating Greek before we think of it. So it's big. No, it doesn't belong to anybody in particular, at least of all the clerical underground.
Well, I mean, I want to talk about that, because if you say we have evidence of the beginnings of sort of astral or astrological and the survivals of technical hermetic practice coming across from Moorish Spain. But this particular mode that we now call Solomonic, what other I'm trying to work out where other routes would be for that kind of thing.
Well, it's been pointed out that Picatrix doesn't have the same spirit aims, for instance, but that aside, there are certainly sort of Arab doubles of the heptameron, which is definitely part of the paper trail. So it might be sort of a list of Deccan-related spirits or something like them numerically coming from Constantinople. Meanwhile, the planetary version coming via the Arabs that just happen to contain quite a lot of the same names, but in different structures.
There's also unusual, because I just want to pick up on that, in the Quirinides, which is essentially a survival of technical hermetic medicine, essentially by pulling together 4 different kingdoms under a Greek letter, but that was still being used and kind of mistranslated as Aristotle in Moorish Spain. But if you actually look at some of them, particularly the ones related to something like Venus, the medical prescription for dropsy is essentially a Venus spell, like to a Venusian spirit. So that's kind of where I wanted to take the conversation, because we have a kind of polyglot, curious precedent of practices that happens prior to the fall of Byzantium, and
Yeah.
and that's the kind of that sort of fecund world of what these might be is where I want to take the question. Like, what did magic look like in Western Europe prior to the arrival of the Grimoires?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, that's a fascinating area, which I've gone into a bit in some of my earlier books, and not so much in this one. It's, it's things like Celtic, Germanic, and other forms of spirit magic fusing with the grimoires. I mean, the same thing happens in the British Isles, Scandinavia, and whatever. You get like this infusion of Hermetic and later on sort of mock Kabbalistic mixing with the local spirit lore and folklore. So people were often, even invoking four kings maybe in Germany before Agrippa comes out and suggests some slightly oriental names for them. Yeah. So in some ways, the shapes have been around for quite a while. This isn't foreign stuff that nationalistic pagans have to reject. I mean, it's potentially very useful to them because what's in a name at the end of the day?
Well, true, and also, how long does something have to be in a land before it becomes indigenous?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I mean, one of the things I find interesting. So in Valentinian, we're talking 300s, ordered death for anyone who snuck out at night to perform harmful magic. Now that's a very specific law. That's not death for magic, because the Romans didn't care. Like, they were quite anti-magic. That's where the Catholics got it from, right? They didn't like divination, except state divination. They were suspicious of all these forms of magic because they are essentially treasonous. But Valentinian has a very specific law, which is you will be killed by the state if you sneak out at night to perform harmful magic. And when you make a law like that, it means people are doing it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And that is where I find, when we talk about, which we'll have to come back to the book. When we talk about the other magicians hypothesis, you kind of have to look at history with look at the hole made by laws in history, starting at the 300s. And Valentinian is one of them, and then you get Theodosius II in the next century, and one of my favorites, like Caesarius of Arles, who just went on this rant about magic and superstition, and in particular all these hick farmers in Arles paying itinerant wandering magicians who had fake holy relics. So we have this form of particularly if we're looking at the other magicians, which we may define as uh, the ones on the fringe of what is already a fringe, we have to find them in the legal precedent. Would you say that's correct?
To an extent, certainly. I mean, you get weird stuff going on with like the Teutonic Knights local crusade against surviving pagans. There's a very strange hinterland thing going on in Bulgaria. There's a sort of sandwich between Catholics and Orthodox, but they've also got the local barbarians who say, no, we don't mind sort of heretics and pagans and magicians hanging out here. So, sod the authorities in these countries. So yeah, Europe's a bloody weird place in the Middle Ages.
Well, true, and also it's Europe as it exists is a modern construction where we're talking about kingdoms and even tribal groups at that point in time. So to make the sort of sweeping statements becomes difficult. Empire is inevitably largely in people's heads.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, that's good. Well, let's tighten up a little bit more on the other magicians, because I want to look at what the other magicians hypothesis is prior to the sort of high Middle Ages grimoire bonanza. And one of the ways to look at it, as we discussed, is through the laws. But if I'm understanding you correctly, there's also like a very specific and unadulterated survival of non-Christianity in certain corners of Europe where people were fine with, as you say, heretics and pagans and other dodgy types.
Yeah, Bulgaria for quite a time, which is why sort of but it's associated with heretics. I mean, you get words like bugger and so on. I mean, it's they're calling heretics Bulgarians, as well as sodomites. It seems to have been a centre. You could have a heretic anti-pope based in Bulgaria quite happily. But also magicians fleeing from Byzantium. But before it was brought down, that's where they tended to end up.
And where
Jewish Kabbalists, all sorts of strange people there. Thracian survivals.
Dualists, have from further east. I mean, that's probably when you talk about bugger, the Bulgar heresy was a specifically sort of Gnostic dualist idea that came from the Near East and thrived in this dodgy land.
Yeah, and the Byzantines weren't always that smart. I mean, they were complicated, but not always that smart. But they used to occasionally transplant a bunch of heretics. They brought a whole bunch of them.
I think
in Bulgaria,
right.
and then later on thought that's not a good idea. They're not backing us against some reason, so they moved them again over into. There's all. If we think the age of racism was back before or during the Romans, there's all sorts of odd stuff going on vis-a-vis the Byzantines' interplay with Europe.
Yeah. Okay, so just 1 second there. I think the headset may have moved.
Anyway, we're not talking about the spirits very much here. We keep going on about historical bloody empires and stuff.
Yeah, well, the reason for that is I'm trying to align, because what we were just talking about there is true. It's the survivals of it. But what I'm trying to get is what happens when the spirits and the grimoires arrive, how this other magician blend happens with the spirit list. So let's take it back to that. Oh, and also when I'm not sure if the headset moved a bit, but you went a bit quiet and then a little bit loud there. So yeah. All right. So let's.
No worries. Yeah. I was probably thrashing around.
Well, let's do that. Let's return to the book, because here's one of the things I thought was quite interesting and may, in fact, help bring us back to talking about the spirits. You have a section about the sublunar, and you say something that I quite like, and I think we need to expand upon, which is, and it's contentious, how could it be that the sublunar predates the planetary?
Well, it's fairly straightforward. The Chaldeans eventually get their ephemerides together in the historical period, and they say, this star moves, it's got a cycle. We'll call it something else. We call it a planet. I mean, that kind of process is actually quite late. In my terms, I mean, not in geological terms, but certainly in historical terms. You can say, look, astrology more or less starts here. And there's thousands of years before that where people, they notice the sun and moon. They're very aware of the stars, and of course they're aware of the earth. They've got ideas about the afterlife and the underworld, and all that's happily bubbling along, creating mythology, in the pre-literate period for thousands of years before astrology comes along, or even the elemental theory comes along and says, how about some way of classifying it and neatening it up?
Yeah.
The sublunar thing totally comes first, and then then astrology gets lumped on top of it, and you need a new idea of a new divine idea there as well, someone to run the planets, a sort of god of time. Whether it's Zervan or Kronos or Sabaoth, who's a sort of interim between a Jewish Platonic Zoroastrian super god and the earlier stuff. There's major theological changes and stuff, but the old stuff carries along, bubbling along, and says, well, actually, I mean, you can't do any of your magic in either of these later phases, either Sabaoth or the transcendental phase, without the original cast, who are all sublunar.
Could not have said it better myself. and that is, I really like that bit, because if you come at the grimoires without context, you will essentially go planet down. But it's in the subluna is where all the old stuff, as you say, the original cast was parked, and parked twice. It was parked in the classical world with the sort of emergence of that Neoplatonic structure to the universe, and then it was parked again in the kind of Latin grimoire phase. But when you read it correctly, when you restore context to it, all the fun ones are there in the subluna.
Yeah.
Which, and this is something that I've been trialing, having read the book, and I think it's quite a good idea. Talk about, let's talk about how, hang on, I've written it correctly. Talk us through the case for starting the Spirits of the 7 Days on a Monday.
Mm. I can't think why it took me so long to really notice. I mean, I've had Grimoire of Honorius more or less at my elbow via Idris Shah since the 1970s. And it was only the last couple of years I finally noticed maybe there's some reason for it starting with the moon rather than, say, the sun or even Saturn. And yeah, it then started to fall into place with the ideas already developed about the more primitive phases of magic, which are essential to it actually functioning. And yeah, there is an amazing logic there, which I'm quite prepared to make use of. Saying, look, we got this traditional grimoiric model, which relates to something in the earlier phase, so we're entitled to do it now.
Oh, absolutely.
And actually makes a kind of sense. I mean, hoodoo and various other traditions also tend to start the week with Monday. It's the beginning of the working week. The god of the opening of the way is Legba, and is the god of the day. And so yeah, it's not an unfamiliar form of classification. It just needs putting into a bigger context, which is at least comparable and a rival to the more straightforward, well-known angelological one.
Yeah, and that's why we asked, or we had the discussion about who the sublunar are and how they predate a planetary system from a magical perspective. Sublunar are the original cast and the fun guys. Moon, Monday, and I like this because this is where we get an interesting kind of pivot in how we talk about the other magicians. Who is the ruler of Monday?
Yeah. The day is attributed to Lucifer, but the ritual you look at the ritual, particularly the circle. There's a circle for each day, and generally, Tuesday through to Sunday, it's the spirit of the day whose name appears on it. But on Monday, it has Trinitas instead of Lucifer. So you get a similar idea to the mayoral in Kimbanda, the three chiefs in one. So it is the ruler day. Lucifer's the main ruler, but the whole Trinitas is implied.
So, do you think people, because Honorius is late, do you think? And this is the speculating wildly, because when we talk about this kind of stuff, particularly when we're trying to trace, beliefs, we have the classic absence of evidence situation.
Mm-hmm.
I find so. Is this an example? Do you think people work that out? Do you think people kind of went sublunar, moon, Lucifer, and given that there is whilst there isn't a defined or a definitive list, there is a shape rather than a structure to engagement with these particular classes of spirits. And a largely immovable part of that is that Lucifer is the boss. And I find this really interesting that and it's why I love this part of the book. There is, and do you think people are actually doing that, or because we're dealing with effectively a living tradition, do you think this is something that we can do now with the restoration of historical context, or do you think people actually were thinking Lucifer, Moon, start with this and go that way?
Oh, I think some of them are certainly thinking that way. Although there's also the possibility that the Inquisition were thinking that way, thinking this is how magicians think, and got it right because they'd read more classical sources and so on. So it's probably quite complex causes as usual, no one single cause. But people were definitely using that way. I mean, the way that that Thursday is the new middle of the week, so to speak. And you get this intermediary figure associated with pacts right in the centre of the week. That's clearly different from the three that go before and the three that come after. And that is obviously structural and being employed on the ground. Not just urban grandeers pact, but elsewhere. There's plenty of signs that this structure was being used and was coherent in some way. That is a little mysterious to us now. I mean, there's probably quite a lot of book burnings going on in the what we might call the Goetic revival in France, which predates Elvis Levi and all that nonsense.
Yeah, it does, and I love that period, and I find it interesting because I know Owen Davies, particularly when he was talking about Honorius, said this was the one that was popular amongst, I think he called them the diabolic dabblers of late 17th century Paris, because you do have earlier grimoires, sort of the Key of Solomon stuff. That was the clerical thing. They were very interested in using that within the context of essentially being dodgy priests. We do have, so from the late 17th century, something different is happening. Like we do get like a more genuine diabolical, and the fact that it was people were dabbling with it, and I think perfectly prepared because they're French, and Protestantism had happened, so that the Catholic Church isn't like an all-powerful descriptor of truth.
Napoleon nobbles the Inquisition, and there's a bit more freedom in the printing industry. So it's all sorts of weird stuff, interesting, helpful stuff for a magical revival.
Yeah, and
it's not one we talk about, but it's a genuine one. It's not a manufactured one.
Well, that's the bit that I want to get. So we have this really exciting, late 17th century. It's you picture it in your head and go, that's like very sexy. You have Paris in the late 17th century, and all these diabolists and so on. It's a really fun and exciting idea. But was it, when you say a revival, was that kind of diabolic form? Does the diabolic form predate it, and by how much? Or was this a reformulation of something that was probably not diabolic but spirit-based? Was this a reformulation of it in, sexy, enlightened Paris?
Well, I mean, some of it was pretty unpleasant, obviously.
Yeah.
I mean, the diabolism, definitely encouraged that to some extent. But at the same time, it seems to have been quite organic and cross demographics. I mean, yes, you had dodgy priests and so on, but you also seem to have had some, shall we say, lower class types involved in it. And mingling. I mean, that was part of the scandal of it. That the aristocracy could be having any truck with these kinds of people for the nefarious purposes. So it's like, it was a revival of sorts. Certainly, numerically quite significant, and probably informed by more than one current. I mean, we've got to remember that part of who defines magic is the opposition. So, if the Inquisition is saying this is what magicians do, some people are going to say, well, okay, then let's give that a try. And the model is quite coherent because it's got a bunch of hostile ecclesiastical academics developing it, and they make a kind of sense out of it. So that is always going to be part of it. I mean, this is about belief rather than history in a strict sense.
All right, I think your headphones slipped again. So there's
a mythological element, a belief element in this all the time.
Yeah,
It's what people believe other people do. It helps create what people are actually doing.
Oh, I love that dialectic. I think you're absolutely correct. And an example that people miss is that the demonic and divine long predate natural magic in Europe. We only get natural magic with the emergence of, the clergy and the lawyers and the people paid by bankers to try and get away with stuff without being burned. And that
Mm-hmm.
sort of presents an interesting, again, absence of evidence possibility for witch parts prior to the High Middle Ages, given that the choices for all these dirty peasants out there still being superstitious, their choices were effectively binary in how they describe magic to themselves. Is it God doing it, or is it the other guys? Because you only get the natural magic choice from the High Middle Ages on, and that's kind of where when you look at how the sort of honorious diabolism of the late 1600s happens, which parts of it survived where and how. And as you say, it's more than one current. I'm just trying to I really enjoy that speculation, because commonly people may suspect that the natural magic thing came first. It didn't. That was the one that had to come back. That's the one that vanished for 1,000 years, and Europe was left with, well, it's demons or it's God. If you're going to do magic,
Mm.
that's who you got.
And when natural magic does come back, some of it's the result the result of a good editing job. Let's cut all the sigils and names out of it and just leave the ingredients. You can see a certain amount of that in Albertus Magnus's attributed Book of Secrets and stuff. Kyranides has still got quite a lot of spirit magic. The headless one is mentioned in there, for instance. Yeah, so natural magic to some extent is still about spirits and angels and so on behind the substances.
Yeah, but what it means for the other magicians is, we have the absence of evidence that their choice was effectively binary, and as you say, it's formed in opposition. It's what the law will describe someone. So with the High Middle Ages and the Grimoire period, natural magic emerges, and it's at that point, because parts of it become respectable, that the description of magic goes from being a continuation of silly superstitions from the pagan world amongst the poor people in the countryside to the work of the devil. And that pivot point, so the arrival of the grimoires kind of others the other magicians. That's the bit where I'm trying to get the flow. If we want to, because I want to do this, we've been talking about the other magicians hypothesis for years.
It's a mess. I mean, people talk about the clerical underground, and they use words like elite. But like I say, I mean, some of them were actually itinerant. These itinerant guys carrying relics around. They're not how we think of elite. I mean, the fact that they could read, just and maybe read Latin a bit, made them elite for a while. But we underestimate how early the general population starts to become literate as well. So it's very easy to try and draw a sociological model, but it's never going to work. It's always complicated.
No, absolutely. It's not just a mess. It's a hot mess. Like, it's fun to think about.
Yes.
Cool. So that's those are the pieces that I think allow us to have a discussion now. Some of the things you open the new book with is the Grimoire Verum, which is obviously, you're rather a fan of. For people,
I am rather a fan of it, but it's got qualities which you can also find in the Grand Grimoire. They're complete systems. So here's the top of the hierarchy, here's the middle bit, and here's the guys they rule. Which the Goetia manifestly fails to do. So there's very practical reasons for choosing the Grimoire Verum, but you could equally well choose the Grand Grimoire, because they've both got that quality of completeness. And there's very little redundancy in either of them either. Whereas the Key of Solomon, because it's a manuscript which gentlemen like to collect, some of the scribes include as many new bits as they can find in other manuscripts, not noticing that several of the weapons are exactly the same one, and that there's no instructions for using most of them, partly as a result. Grand Grimoire and Grimoire and Verum have got none of that. They're very neat, stripped-down systems, the equipment you actually need, what you need them for, and how the spirit hierarchy works in order to conjure effectively. That shows that people on the ground were using them, or that the manuscript sources were particularly bloody good because they were in use.
Yeah, so that's the bit I wanted to go with. For people who are unfamiliar with Grand Grimoire or Verum, these are effectively 1800s. But before we have the discussion about the sources that they were using, you do have stripped-down systems. Well, you have streamlined. You have an efficient system, and it seems like you can make a very good case. We were just talking about what Owen Davies, I think, like the diabolic dabblers of late 17th century Paris. Mm-hmm. You have that's the evolution of it. So by the time you get to the Grand Grimoire, even though it's GV, even though it's 1800s, you have it evolved out of that kind of late 17th century dabblers, and it was these people who may or may not, and again, we're in absence of evidence, have had access.
Well, not entirely. I mean, Joseph Peterson right now is working on Liber Secretis, which seems to be a much earlier predecessor of the Grimoire and Verum, and more likely to have supplied the various components than either of the two that have been touted before.
Well, that's I mean, absence of evidence in the sense that when you're dealing with historical documents from 400 years ago, there just aren't that many of them, and the ones we have are the ones we have, and it doesn't say much about the ones we don't have.
It's sketchy, and as I've mentioned in the introduction, like we have to take the sketchiness into account. That there is gaps in the literary record, and allowance has to be made for them, but not just in favour of the gentleman collectors. It has to be taken into account in general. The so-called blue grimoires actually may have had excellent manuscript sources that we're just unaware of, and it looks very much as if they did. And there's a historical context that would have provided it.
And I'm interested in the sequence of that, because at the moment we can describe it one of two ways, which is once you get to that diabolic dabbler period and people think, oh, I'm quite into this, they can turn around and look for they can look back in time or go to libraries or auction houses and get some earlier texts which we no longer have. Or, and this is where I mean the kind of absence of evidence thing, or does that mode come from earlier back? Do you know what I mean?
I think, there's a certain amount of continuity, and it's in the spirit catalogues often, rather than the apparatus and attribution of author and so on. It's in the spirit catalogues. You can see there's been quite a long-standing hole in the literary record regarding the northern spirits, but the eastern ones have been intact for a long time, and the people who framed the Grimoire and Verum and the Grand Grimoire were well aware of that and made the East their focus. Much as during the Anglophone occult revival in the last 20 years, we some of us have figured out that's maybe a good idea ourselves. Plus we'd read French more, we would have come to the decision earlier. But they were aware of gaps going back to the 1400s at least. And they'd worked around them in very efficient ways, more efficient, I think, than Dr. Rudd.
How so? More efficient than Dr. Rudd, for people who aren't familiar with what you just said?
Well, I think Dr. Rudd spotted that there were problems with the hierarchy in Weir's text or Scott and other sort of similar sources. There should be a chain of command here, and he was trying to put it back together and restructure the entire order of the spirits in Weir to suit. I don't think he made that good a job of it. Part of Pandemonium clarifies why. I mean, there's a separate group of four kings going on, headed by Bilef, including Asmodee, Belial, and possibly Garp, which is a completely different set of four kings. There's no real mention of the three chiefs, but somehow he gets that back because I think Rudd's connected to, or he's got access to either Oberon or something very similar. So he's able to see that there's gaps in the materials he's building the Goetia from, and try and work around it. I think the French did a better job with the Grand Grimoire and the Grimoire Verum of making a coherent hierarchy that relates to the previous forms of it very, very closely. And it's an up and running operating system that people can see when they read it, which you can't in the Goetia. Where's the three chiefs? Who are the four kings, and which ones of these spirits are attributed to them? That is not clear at all in the Goetia. So, and that's after Rudd and co have all had a go at it. Whereas this continental tradition, it's much more coherent and workable from the get-go.
Well, towards the end of the book,
that's why I think they did a better job than Rudd. With all credit to the guy, he had a massive problem. I'm kind of aware of what he was taking on, but different milieu. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. And when you're talking about, and you kind of mentioned this at the end of the book, which is problematizing is the wrong word, contextualizing Goetia of Solomon, and which part of it is the Goetia when we're talking about the sort of clavicular cluster. Let's go back to why this is a discordant concordance, because I think we just touched on it a bit there with the shape of this system, which again remains in a permanent quantum state, because as we discussed before, like that's just what happens when you're dealing with lists of actual spirits. But there's a general structure, a workable one that appears more like that's in the GV, for instance, and other places and the story of this book is about looking for how that shape is about putting some flesh around that shape. Would that be fair?
Yeah, and making it operative or more operative. Yeah. And so, okay, it's obvious, this guy can lead us to these guys and they can lead us to these, but there's some other stuff has come up in Pandemonium, like characters who've been more or less marginalized, but previous editors seem to have been aware, hey, this guy's huge. Don't know quite how he fits into the structure, but God, he's huge. Like Sergat, aka Parkas, and his other pseudonyms. I'm not the first person to spot that he probably goes all the way back to Azazel or Azael. But it's so they kind of creep along in the subtext as important characters. You've actually got to work the system and examine it closely to discover them. Okay, there's the big three and there's the big four, but there's these other big guys, in there. And how we locate them and render it operative without sticking a pin in it like a butterfly so it doesn't so it's lifeless. I don't want to over bloody analyze any of this. That's not how it's about. It's meant to have vague edges that are just suggestive enough for you to get where you're going.
No, absolutely. And I think there's, for people who are, because I'm going to ask you a question that's going to be a bit annoying in a sec, but I'm going to preempt it by what you just said is, well, the question, and you have a few minutes to think about it. Inevitably, it is operant dependent, but I'm going to ask you what the shape of this operation would look like as an off-the-shelf version. So, what engagement with spirits in the structure that is implied in GV and its antecedents? I'm going to ask you that, but the first thing I'm going to say is further elaboration. If people are expecting it to look like like the shape where you go, well, there's a 3 at the top, and then there's the other 4, and then there's X number of ones underneath, and they all fall neatly under each of these 4, and these 4 fall neatly under these 3. What you've just said is that, in fact, in some of the characters that now appear in the background, some of them are bigger and some of them are smaller, and it's almost like some glow brighter than others, and by feeling your way through them, you can practically encounter what may have been that continuation. So that there's this entire list, but within that list, and it doesn't really, and where they are in a structure isn't dependent on it, some of them are bigger and some of them are more closely associated with the current that you were describing than others.
Hmm. Yep, yep, there are definitely undercurrents, and in some ways it has to be left sufficiently loose to allow those to emerge in the course of your work, rather than just rather than just saying, "I'm going to want to get paid and laid, and this guy will help, and bugger the rest." Which it isn't the way I've approached the grimoires. Obviously, I mean, there's been a strong investigative element there, which has often ended up with me doing rather more conjuration than I need to do. But that's another story.
Well, okay, so this is the question that's a bit annoying because it is opera independent, and I just want to caveat that for everyone listening. But what is the ritual, off-the-shelf ritual structure implied in this way of thinking about these particular collections of spirits?
Cool. Oh, how to make that a succinct answer? Well, obviously there's rituals for preparing the space and so forth. There's directional considerations, which might seem a bit complicated when you look at it on paper, but there are not so much cheats, but at least strategies for making it simpler. But effectively, yes, you do have to, in your conjuration phase, you do have to invoke a superior power to give you the authority to approach the next level. And there's some messenger mechanisms before you actually get down to the people you want to talk to. And this hierarchical process, I mean, is fairly well demonstrated going way back to the papyri and beyond. Invoke, approach, command in at least 3 stages before you get down to the guys who are actually going to do the work. So that's always going to be there and should be more or less clear before you even start. But as I say, there are strategies. There are particular superiors within the structure who can pressure the right person even if you don't know who it is.
And that'll be a mentioning no names thing because the magician should find out for him or herself.
Yeah.
All right, so that we have essentially an opening, which is a circle is the most common form of it. And then we have the directionality. And as you say, there are shortcuts. So when people look at a hierarchy, it is not... the hierarchy isn't so much a thing that exists in the world, although it does. It's kind of steps in a recipe. So you need to know hierarchy rather than hierarchy is the launch codes rather than the shape of where they all sit in some big spirit palace somewhere. And so opening, directionality, invocation by use of this hierarchy, by essentially playing it like an organ to get to the ones you want. And you're right about that shape because I know people struggle with it, and what I definitively don't want people to think this structure implies is that these are friendly beings, and actually you can approach them without. Well, you can approach them at your own risk without this system, but it has been built. It's thousands of years old at this point in time of using one name to do another thing.
There is generally a reason for the stuff. It's not just there to make it complicated and only work for educated people. Which I'm not for a start. So, there are built-in safeguards. It should be taken seriously, but the magician should be brave rather than fearful.
No, agreed. But the bits to you may not get the electricity switched on if you avoid the hierarchy because you've decided in your head that it's some sort of Christian holdover, which is the structure is definitively pre-Christian. I mean, if you look at Dr. Skinner's work about where the shape of it is.
With me, it's not very Christian or Judaic at all. I mean, I work strictly through the demonic hierarchy. I don't go to angels or celestial divinities for authority.
Well, that is exactly. So we're going to come back to what the off-the-shelf shape is. So step one, space creation, typically a circle. Step four, well, step four, step 1.5 is the directionality component. But when we talk, and then the invocation, which can either come as part of the directionality or immediately after. That's when we were talking about Monday and the subluna and Lucifer. Retain the shape. Don't dismiss the shape because you think it's Christian. The spirits have a shape that this works through, and in the case of the kind of officers cluster of spirits, Lucifer's at the top. So this is what I mean. You kind of people have to get their heads around hierarchy so that they can discern the shape of the ritual
Yeah,
structure.
yeah,
Otherwise,
yeah. But we don't necessarily need all these titles, like Duke and Count and so forth. But hierarchy is nevertheless a part of the process. And I mean, the magician, might be a sort of wandering sort of anarcho-kabbalist or whatever. But nevertheless, the hierarchy exists in nature, and it most certainly exists in models of magic.
yes.
It just doesn't have to go up to some super celestial bloody region to work.
Yes, double yes. Did you just say anarcho-kabbalist?
I did.
What the hell is that? That's amazing.
Anarcho-Kabbalists. You would have found them in the Ukraine around 1905 up to possibly the 1920s. They speculated about a verse in the Book of Kings that actually, was it Judges? There was no king in Israel in those days, and each man did what was righteous in his sight. There was sort of mystical, revolutionary types. Ain Malik, no king. Yeah.
Awesome. I did not know.
I love all that weird Ukrainian stuff.
Yes, I know.
I can't seem to get it out of my head.
I'd never heard of narco-kabbalist before. What an awesome term. I think that's quite important because I've sort of struggled to articulate this correctly. Like the hierarchy is functional rather than descriptive, and so you can't really dispense with it. Otherwise, it's just not. It's not going to work because, as you say, it exists in nature. One of my favorite, I think it's Acts, but anyway, it's when Paul is kind of having a magic competition with a Jewish priest in Ephesus, and the priest tries to summon a demon who does show up, but the demon says, "Well, Paul I know, and Jesus I know, but who are you?" And that's the shape. Like you actually have to get the names, and when people think it's sort of bullying or ordering around, that's only how it's described in the text, and only in some of them. The actual shape needs to be there, which if you're just not doing this type of magic, if that step isn't part of your launch sequence.
Yeah. The spirits aren't fluffy bunnies, and neither should you be.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And
you're not necessarily going to pick a fight with them or them with you, but there should be a sort of respectful. Okay, you're a geezer.
There's also
otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah, exactly. There are other modes you can, and actually I had this discussion with Julia all the time. There are other magical modes. If this one doesn't resonate with you, if this particular shape doesn't resonate with you, find another one, because it's not gonna, like, you won't get the ship into the air if you're not running to a structure. And that's what I think is so important about Pandemonium, is we can talk so that people don't get lost in the weeds of, okay, well then what is the structure, as a description. Because we're having a discussion about it, people can get their heads around that shape and work the shape rather than what's on the page. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, some Italian Renaissance guy, I can't remember his name now, seems to have a completely different idea of the art model to what we have nowadays, where he was working with Orions and Paimon and Maimon and Agene and their subordinates, instead of the bunch of angels that we understand now. So this is a convenient framework. And can be there's another simple grimoire to operate, is the Grimoire of Chirail, but it wouldn't necessarily have to work with that hierarchy. It gives you ritual framework, the candlesticks, the instruments, and yeah, you could be, if you knew what you were doing, you could approach this through a variety of source texts,
Absolutely.
or a hybrid. Yeah, this idea that only purism is going to work, I think, is absurd. I mean, you've got to do it like a bunch of medieval clerics did. Well, for a start, they didn't order their stuff on eBay.
No, that's a very good point. And I think that's completely correct. And so if you look at something like Pandemonium and well, your edition of the True Grimoire, for instance, you got enough there, and this is the crucial point. It kind of comes back to there are some spirits that are brighter or larger that may appear in the background of various lists that are probably more important to this current. Once you can get, and that's why I wanted to talk through the ritual structure, once you can get those bits to work, you can then find, I call them like, it's sort of like snakes and ladders. You can find the ladders rather than the snakes in the list, and then your praxis and your form will become individualized to the magician, which is the whole point. But it is only with engagement with the spirits that you start to develop your own form of subsequent engagement with them. And to get to that first step, here are the launch codes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and here's the contacts you need to make. Yeah.
Well, that's the whole point. They're out there, and and the thing is, if we assert, and we should obviously, if we assert personhood and agency to the spirit, so that it's not just some monks playing crosswords in the 1400s. We got to drop out. Anyway, I'll jump back in because I was halfway through. I think what was it? Hopefully,
monks doing crosswords in the 1400s. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but if we assert personhood to them rather than it just being a literary artifact of history, then some of them just aren't going to be that into you, and vice versa. So you have a shape.
That's a very important point. Yeah.
Yeah. You have a shape.
Yeah, there's always
going
to be a personal element in it.
And it could be that you're you may find some little spirit in the corner somewhere that no living magicians have done too much with or have much to say about, and you and it may get along great.
Well, there are a few. There are a few, there's Duke Suke, for instance, not in the Goetia, so nobody's been paying him any attention, but is in 2 or 3 other texts, and has obviously been around for quite a while, and some intrepid magician might decide that cases like that deserve investigation. Let's find out more about these guys. I certainly hope that is going to be going on, and I envisage doing a little of it myself in the not too distant.
With that specific spirit, or are you going to go and find some other sadly ignored?
Well, there's a few in there. Some of the the ones who are well known, but we didn't know quite who they were, are certainly going to be included in my future contacts. But yeah, some of these ones are just nobody seems to have known about until they turned up in an undervalued spirit list somewhere or another, and then another one, and then another one. You think, okay, this guy definitely got a track record. Let's find out more about him.
Actually, do you know what? That's quite a good point to end on, which is we've talked through the structure, we've talked through your amazing new book. We've given people there are launch code options for this particular method of working this with or working the spirits, and I think people should have a bash at it.
Well, ideally, yeah, it's not compulsory, obviously.
No. You can read this as an armchair magician. Basically, I'm saying go and buy Jake's book, everyone.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly hope there's going to be some experimentation and into areas where people haven't really been prying before, and less search for the U-burst table that it's all going to fit into, and more interest in the personalities.
Yeah, that's true. So is that actually? I just realised there's probably a good question in there. What are the trends? What are the things you like that are happening in the magic world at the moment, and what would you like to see less of?
Well, I mean, quite a lot of the stuff that I'm not especially interested in provides useful smoke screens. So I can be tolerant on that count. But I think there is more of an urge to go back underground, or at least partly underground, out there, and not to require the authorities' approval of what you're doing in order to get on with it. You know, you're not attributing that that spirit to the right decan or whatever. You can't be doing it right. Well, that spirit's not in my system, so you can't be doing it right. Well, bugger that. You know, if a group of spirits out of all these catalogues, no one in particular, but there's some from each direction, happen to be the ones you get on with, there's no reason why a coherent system shouldn't develop out of that. Local spirit cults are definitely something I'd like to see developing. Yeah. I mean, obviously some people can go crazy and burn their fingers with it, but at the same time, grassroots mythology in action is how things actually happens rather than in the ivory towers.
Yeah, splendid. I agree completely.
Along.
And what's a few burnt fingers?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've got no problems with burnt fingers. Well, obviously, not too often. I mean, take natural safeguards. I mean, when I'm casting lead, I do tend to wear gloves and sturdy boots and have sufficient ventilation. But it doesn't stop me sort of working with molten metal.
That's a very good metaphor. It's probably why it is a metaphor for. It's probably why metallurgy is so intimately associated with this kind of thing, going back to Greece.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, Mr. Stratton-Kent, this has been another fantastic discussion. All the details about the book will be linked.
Another rambling editor's nightmare.
Nah, it's fine. It's we had one dropout. It's all good. Yes, so all the information about the book will be listed in the show notes. Congratulations once again. Some top work there. And thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you. It's been delightful talking to you as ever, Gordon.
Well, I don't know about you, but I got a lot out of that. I certainly hope the discussion of the ritual shape, for instance, is useful for all you budding other magicians out there. For the less budding ones, I suggest taking the Monday week shape out for a spin. I've certainly got some mileage out of it, having had a play with the book since it's come out. I would say Pandemonium is an essential component of the exegesis Stratton-Kentium, and it, I think, really helps, I guess, bellows breathe some life into what can look at first glance to be, a mere list of some funny-sounding words. And speaking of funny-sounding words, YouTube, iTunes, podcatchers. That's where you can subscribe to the show if you are so inclined. And one note, if you are listening to this episode soon after it dropped, be aware that I'm currently on a remote, tiny island in the Pacific. So there may be some delay in responding to your feedback and discussions, which I certainly hope this episode will instigate. So do say hi. Say hi at the Rune Soup Facebook page, or find me on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.